Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast. I am your host, Tommy, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, my dad, Matt. Dad, how you doing?
Doing well. I'm actually here in Wisconsin, home state of the Packers. In time for some heat and humidity, but it's nice to see Packer people wearing Packers gear and Packers gear in the stores. So that's nice. And I had some deep fried cheese curds this week, twice this week already.
Twice this week already. Have you gotten frozen custard yet?
I have not had frozen custard yet. But
Okay. Well, just get some for
me. I have
me.
hit the traditional cheese curds,
Okay.
which you can't.
Well, as long
get
as you're hitting the
deep. You can't get deep fried cheese curds out in California.
You can't even really get regular cheese curds out in
You
California.
can't
It's
get
almost
fresh
not even
cheese
worth
curds
it.
out there. It's just they're not fresh. They're not right.
No, not at all. But anyway, thanks so much for joining me from our home state of Wisconsin, or home-ish state, I suppose. But I'm sure it is nice to be seeing a bunch of Packers fans. And we are here, as always, to talk about the Packers. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about the second open practice of OTAs. And then we're kind of beginning to wind down our deep dives into the prospects. We're going to be talking today about Sean Clifford, Grant Dubose, and Lew Nichols. So we're kind of doing three at once since we're getting towards the end of the draft, a little less to talk about for each of them. But we'll still be giving you plenty of information, so don't you worry. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some news and notes. There's some things around the Packers that we got to talk about, I'm sure. And some things that are about around the Jets that I guess we have to talk about as well. But before we do that, just wanted to pitch.
We may or may not stay on the rails.
Yes, we may or may not. But before we do that, just wanted to pitch a couple of things. If you enjoy what you heard here, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We tweet out when we have new episodes. We tweet out articles we find interesting, pieces of news. For instance, the OTAs were today, so we were retweeting anything and everything we could find in terms of clips and announcements and stuff like that. So come give us a follow there if you enjoy what you heard, and then come subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, even on YouTube. We put all of our episodes up there. If you subscribe on YouTube, we'd really appreciate it because it would really help our numbers. But Dad, let's get down to it, and let's start with the news. Let's talk about the OTAs first. So unfortunately, let's start with some bad news, injuries, and absences. So unfortunately, let's start with the absences. So these are optional, of course. No player has to be there. They may have a very good reason for not being there. But players who were not in attendance were Jair Alexander, Rasul Douglas, Keyshawn Nixon, and Jonathan Garvin were not in attendance. And then, unfortunately,
So I think Nixon was Nixon there last week?
I believe Nixon was at the last one, yes, because we were talking about players playing outside corner.
Right, so only 3 players have missed both open to the media sessions. I think Jair,
yes,
Rasul, and Garvin. The other
sounds
people
right.
Who missed last week came in this week.
Yeah, and that sounds right. And then the interesting one for that was that Alexander and Douglas do have workout bonuses for OTAs, so they are forfeiting some money for not being there, but it is what it is. Injury-wise, unfortunately, some players missing. We don't really know the severity of them, but Stokes obviously still not practicing. Gary obviously still not practicing. Jake Hansen still not practicing. Dontavian Wicks not practicing. Tucker Kraft not practicing, and Grant Dubose still not practicing. So that is a bit unfortunate, and we did unfortunately have a few players exit early as well. Devontae Wyatt exited practice early and then did not participate in the 11-on-11s. And then Bakhtiari did practice today. He was back, as was Elton Jenkins and Preston Smith and Dallin Levitt, who missed the last open OTAs but were at this one. But Bakhtiari did not practice in 11-on-11s. I don't think he exited early to injury. I just don't think I guess the plan wasn't to have him participate in 11-on-11s, with his knee, probably just taking it easy.
Load management, right? Probably just load management.
Which is, I think, is the right decision with everything that he's had to go through. And then let's end on some good news. Quay Walker was practicing despite getting banged up in the last open OTAs. I was a little worried just because he didn't finish practice then, but looks like he's good to go. He practiced. Everything seems fine for him. But Dad, let's move on to the interesting notes. And this is something that you kind of spotted at the last ones, but Zach Tom is getting the initial starting reps at right tackle with the O-line. They went Bakhtiari, Jenkins, Myers, Runyon, and then Tom at right tackle. He did rotate with Nyman during the 11-11s on who was playing at that spot with the starters. But definitely something to kind of keep an eye on. And would you like to take your small victory lap?
Yeah. So, and one thing I'd like to add to that, you kind of picked up on that. It looked like Tom had put on some good weight in the off season, which was kind of his biggest weakness, is his size. So if he's been put on some more size and functional strength, then that really could set him up to be a very good in the NFL.
Yeah,
considering how well he did everything else.
If he can put like the weight on and then maintain the foot speed and stuff, I mean, sky's the limit, because there were definitely times where I was like, is Mercedes Lewis bigger than you? I'm really not sure. He definitely might be.
Which one of you is the tackle and which one's the tight end? I got a lot of people say he was.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Year. But here's a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned like he was rotating with Nyman in the 11-11s. What do they do with left tackle with Bakhtiari not in the 11-on-11s?
Caleb Jones was starting at left tackle in the 11-on-11s.
He started a left tackle 11,
which is interesting.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah. You'd think like maybe they'd go. You'd think they'd maybe go like Rasheed Walker. I guess Caleb Jones, we just didn't get to see much of him last year because he did have mono for most of the year. But they did keep him on the 53 all of last year, so it is interesting that they went with him to start at left tackle there.
Well, I think he was ahead of Walker in the depth chart last year in training camp and preseason. He had some reps in there where he put a couple of nice plays on tape.
Well, we have to remember. We have to remember with Walker was hurt for a lot of the preseason last year.
This is true. He had the foot injury, so he couldn't work out, and he's probably still recovering from that. So this is fair.
Yeah, and then some other interesting notes from OTAs today. Colby Wooden, rookie out of Auburn, 4th-round pick, was filling in for Wyatt at defensive tackle with the ones when Wyatt went out. And then LaFleur said Stokes might be ready for some individual work by the end of OTAs, but doesn't expect him to do any team reps before the end of off-season activities. So I'm guessing he's probably not going to be ready by week 1.
But that still he's like ahead of where I expected. If he's going to start doing some individual workout and not just be, kind of rehab work during OTAs. That's a little bit ahead of where I expected at this point. I thought maybe he'd only be doing rehab during OTAs and mandatory minicamp, and then maybe start doing individual stuff late in training camp. And so this is in some ways a little bit ahead of where I take this as a positive development compared to where I was expecting based on his description of the injury and where he was at in terms of being in a wheelchair in January. So I'd say they're making progress. The Wooden thing is also, I think he was the kind of next man up in the D-line last week as well, and seems to be ahead of.
Well, there's not many people there for him to be ahead of, to be fair.
The list is kind of short. It's true.
Because I took note of that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I was like, he's getting reps over, and then I looked, and I was like, not really anyone else they're going to put there. Yeah, it's like, I think Ford would have been Ford or Chris Slayton would have been the ones I would have thought, just because they've been there longer. But it seems like they're just letting Wooden slide right into that spot.
Yep.
Beyond that, though, I think those are the most interesting takeaways from OTAs today. Seems like Love had another kind of, some good passes, some bad passes. Musgrave had a really good day, according to the people that were there. He just looked really natural.
The one video clip I saw that a lot of people posted was that catch he makes. The ball. I don't know who threw it, but it's a little bit behind him. But he does a spinning catch and almost doesn't break stride as he lands and continues going downfield.
A nice little pirouette for sure. And then it seemed like to me, just based on the feed everyone had going, Dobbs had quite a nice day. And then in the 11-on-11s, the starters started in 11 personnel with Jones, DeGuara, and then Reed in the slot with Dobbs and Watson on the outside.
Okay, so as opposed to I think it was 21 personnel last week, where they had...
Yes.
Okay.
And
so
then
Reed in the
defensively...
slot ahead of Toure.
Yes, and Reed was in the slot ahead of Toure in the last open OTAs too. So I'm not that surprised. I mean, you take him with the top 50 pick. I would be a little surprised if, even though Toure's been there longer, even though they've talked very highly of him, I would be surprised if a 7th rounder from 2 years ago is ahead of him at this point.
Fair.
Yeah. So beyond that, though, we do have a little bit of other news to talk about. and that is the story from Matt Schneidman of The Athletic, where he spoke with Aaron Rodgers. Kind of, that just seems like everyone wants to have the last word in edgewise, I guess, at this point.
Right. I mean, you could probably go another 5 or 6 articles, giving Gutekunst and Rodgers another turn, saying that giving the last word.
Hey, it's the off season. We need the content, I guess. I'll take whatever content I can get, I guess. But pretty much the gist of the article was he was essentially Schneidman reached out to Rodgers, and then Rodgers gave some comments, essentially on Gutekunst's comments about not being able to get a hold of Rodgers. I think the most interesting pieces from this article, besides essentially Rodgers like refuting a lot of the things Gutekunst said, so it's like a bit of a he said scenario. But I thought the most interesting piece from the article was in 2021, Rodgers' agent called Mark Murphy and asked to either fire Gutekunst or trade Rodgers, essentially, was like the ultimatum they gave. That ultimately didn't come to anything, but I thought that was interesting to hear that.
That was the rumor at the time, actually. Remember? That actually was going around as he was asked for that. And then people kind of blew it off, or is this real or not? And so now it seems to be coming out that this was, though apparently what Rodgers said, it was his agent who said that. I didn't say it. My agent said that.
Which of course, like whatever. Of course.
I mean, the article
completely different.
2 different things entirely. But the article has got a lot of stuff in it. It's a fascinating read anyway.
Yeah, and then the other interesting things, I mean, a lot of it's just like essentially Rodgers is saying like, Gutekunst said he couldn't get a hold of me or like couldn't get in contact with me, but I did respond. I didn't ghost him. I would just take a little while to respond. And so it's like, okay, like we're really just like mincing words here.
Well, I mean, Rodgers loves mincing words.
He said he didn't go. He said he didn't ghost. It was pretty much
he didn't ghost the team. Isn't that
no?
The way he
I think he
it?
said. He said there wasn't any ghosting, I think, was the way he phrased it, if I remember correctly.
I can't remember how carefully parsed
sentence
was.
If you want to talk about...
He loves parsing words very carefully.
If you want to talk about quotes that were very, very interesting, is like, I talk to people I like was quite the quote. So that'll tell you how he feels about Gutekunst.
Yeah, that's...
but... Yeah, it is what it is.
That had a very specific meaning.
Yes, and then the other interesting pieces were Rodgers believing that Russ Ball was really the only member of the front office to improve their communication after he requested better communication, and that Green Bay didn't feel. The other thing was that essentially, from an anonymous source, Schneidman said that the Packers didn't feel like Rodgers was as committed in 2022, and they weren't as satisfied with his level of commitment, with that being like missing OTAs and missing parts of the offseason program, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, things like this kind of come out when you have a really tough season, and I think it just kind of cements in my mind that it was just kind of time to move on for both parties. And can we just actually move on? Because it feels like we've said we're moving on and we're still here. We're still taking some...
We are contributing to the problem that we are bemoaning by spending this much oxygen on. But it's amazing how much this dominated Twitter today. An article about a Jets player.
Yeah. I was like, we're really just recycling a lot of the same talking points, and I feel like we have to talk about it because it was one of the biggest stories for the Packers today, and it came out today as we're recording to you Wednesday night, May 31st. But I'm just like, can we just move on? Can we actually move on? We've moved on entirely. We don't need to keep doing this. I'm not. This isn't like a shot at Schneidman or anything. I thought it was a very well written article, and it was very, I would think, well written.
Somebody would call it like
unbiased.
the article of the off season.
Yeah, it was a very good article. It had some good quotes, but I'm just like, can we just stop? Can we just be done? Can we just we went our separate ways? You're Rodgers is a Jet now. Wishing the best for him there. Wishing all the success in the world. Wishing for us to get as good a draft pick as we can, though, at the same time.
Wishing for him to play 65% of the snaps.
Yep. And then,
sure.
I mean, and Rodgers said some nice things about Love in the article too. Everyone should go read it if they can, if they have a subscription to The Athletic. It's a good read. But let's move on to we are giving this a lot of oxygen. The only other piece of news really is that the Packers will be doing some joint practices with the Bengals, as well as the previously announced ones with the Patriots during the preseason. I think that's just good for the team to get as many reps against real competition as possible.
I was pleasantly surprised to hear this. I did not expect joint practices with two different teams. But yes, I think especially with a young team, this is good to have two different sets of competitive practices against two different teams with kind of different strengths. I think it's a good thing.
And it's kind of unusual, I think, to have two different joint practices.
I have never heard of this before, but maybe I just haven't paid enough attention around the league. But I have not heard of teams having joint off-season practices with two different teams before.
Me either. And so that was just something to note. I think it'll be very good for the team. But that's kind of it for news and notes. Should we move on to some deep dives into these players, starting with Sean Clifford?
Yep. So we have the last three offensive players that we drafted. We're going to do them in draft order. So it's kind of a mix of positions, though. With Sean Clifford being the first one, fourth round pick, QB from Penn State, pick 149. The second of their fourth round picks, right? Had Wooden and then Clifford. And so my initial reaction when this happened was, that's a reach to take him that early, with a lot of people projecting him as a seventh rounder or UDFA.
And actually, just to quickly interject, actually, it was the second of their fifth round picks.
Oh, sorry, second of their fifth round. Yeah, they only had one in the fourth. Yeah, second of first of their fifths.
What's the first of their fifths? You're right, because it went Clifford and then Wicks.
It's Clifford. It's Wooden, then Clifford, then Wicks. And I just drew the round line in the wrong place. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, but pick 149 still. But anyway, initial thoughts.
So generally,
what were your initial thoughts on the pick?
So that I thought it was a bit of a reach, because I think it's generally kind of bad process to get so attached to a single player that you don't get the most for your draft value. Though you could see, they definitely made this pick because of the run on QBs that happened just before.
I have a quote on that for later. I have a quote on that for later. We can do. We have a direct quote from Gutekunst. We'll talk about it.
We will get back to this, listeners. So how about you? What was your initial reaction?
Yeah, so my reaction came more from just the idea of the backup quarterback spot in general. I was a bit surprised they went with youth for quarterback depth. I kind of assumed they were going to sign a vet after the draft. It felt like if you're already going to have be starting a young quarterback, it would have made more sense to me to have a guy who's kind of played a lot of games, who's kind of been there, done that, and is used to just quarterback meetings, to be more of a voice in the room, to be more of a vet, etc., as the backup. So that was I was a little surprised that they went with assuming Clifford is going to be the backup. He's been the third quarterback so far in OTAs, I believe, at least based on the first OTA practice. It wasn't clear on this one. So I was a little surprised that they didn't decide to go for a vet for the number 2 guy, but we'll talk about it a little bit. I think I'm higher on Clifford than almost anyone. But we'll talk about it. But let's move on to a little bit more on Clifford, and let's start with the athletic profile. And I think that is one of the enticing things about Clifford, is he is a plus athlete. So he does have a 9.04 relative athletic score at the quarterback position. He is 6'2", 216 pounds, with pretty decently sized hands, 9 and 6/8, I believe that is. No, 9 and 5/8 inch hands. 30.5 inch vert, 9 foot 8 inch broad, which is up in the 83rd percentile. Really nice 40-yard dash at 4.62, which is up in the 93rd percentile, with a really elite 10-yard split as well at 1.6. Great agility is 4.25 shuttle, which is around the 81st percentile, and a 6.84 three-cone, which is the 95th percentile. So a really good athlete at the quarterback position. Some athletic comps for him based on RAS are Deshaun Watson, C.J. Beathard, Mitchell Trubisky, so players you've heard of, and then Matt Scott out of Arizona, and Shazan Mumphrey out of New Haven, so some players you might not have heard of, but some athletic quarterbacks that he compares favorably to. He actually has a better relative athletic score than Jordan Love, despite being smaller. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, so I think one of the things that is really a selling point for him is his overall athleticism. Now, he doesn't have the strongest arm, and he's not the most accurate, but he has really good athleticism. And Dad, he was very productive at Penn State and played there for a long time. Do you want to talk a little bit about his production there?
Yeah, so he started for what, five years for Penn State?
No, I think 4 years at Penn State as a starter.
He only had a few dropbacks in 2018, but 4-year starters, lots of reps, lots of work. Apparently chased off Will Levis.
Yep.
To Kentucky.
Beat out Will Levis for the job was the reason Will Levis went to Kentucky. So, Will Levis went top of the second round. Something to think about.
And some of the kind of the raw stats, he's Penn State's all-time leader in passing yards, passing touchdowns, and completion percentage per Dane Brugler. And 2022, well, except, throw out 2018 because it's a tiny sample size, like 7 pass attempts. But 2022 was his best year for overall PFF rating and passing rating. So that's encouraging anyway. He didn't have his like counting stats weren't as high, but his efficiency, yards per attempt, TD to interception ratio, turnover worthy plays, all improved in his last year. So that's encouraging. There's some other things though.
Certainly.
Do you want to add a little bit more to that?
No, go ahead.
Right. So then if you look at some of the advanced numbers, and I kind of, if you look at either like players who had a decent number of dropbacks in 2022 and across all classes, he was like 23rd out of 121 in adjusted completion percentage. So that's giving credit when a pass was on target but dropped, and also 23rd in turnover worthy plays. So you get penalized if it's still counted as a turnover-worthy play if a pick is dropped, but not a turnover-worthy play if it bounces off your receiver's hands and then goes for an interception. So what really is your own fault and not somebody else's? Now, other things. So that's kind of top 5th in the nation, but he's only 82nd in average depth of target. This is out of I think there were like 121 qualifiers. And 52nd in yards per attempt, and kind of slow on the trigger, 80th in time to throw, and only 88th in big time throw percentage. So I think he's feasting on a lot of sort of short yardage, high percentage pass attempts.
Yeah, and I mean, in his last year in college, 8.5 like ADOT, which is like essentially how far down the field you're throwing, amongst like quarterbacks playing 50% of dropbacks, 58th in the league. He threw 22 touchdowns and 7 picks in his last year in college, which is, I'd say, it's fairly good. It was kind of like a middle of the pack, like upper half quarterback in a lot of metrics, kind of like right around middle in a lot of metrics. It's just not. It's not the boat.
I did like this one that you saw that I missed about his play against pressure.
Yes, so he did have the 18th lowest pressure to sack conversion rate, which, it's not a perfect stat, but it might indicate some good escapability. A lot of pressures are not turning into sacks. He's able to get the ball out, throwaways, etc., which is like, I know that's literally the opposite of sexy, but, that's what you want a backup quarterback to do. You don't want them to kill you out there. And the fact that he's not taking a lot of sacks in terms of like the number of pressures he's getting is a good thing. In terms of what scouts thought about him, they were not very high on him. The resounding thing is most people were not high on Clifford.
And if you look at his tape, it's a bit all over the map. He's got some nice highlight throws. Of course, you could probably find highlight throws from almost every QB. But he's also got some throws like, whoa, that was like, who was he throwing to there? You can't even tell. It's like so far off target.
And I think that the accuracy is the biggest question mark with him. Like Brugler said, like this is a quote from Dane Brugler of The Athletic, who had him as his 20th quarterback. Quote, overall, Clifford throws well on the move and NFL teams love his toughness and smarts, but his current decision-making and ball placement are too inconsistent for what is required at the next level. And then Zierlein, I took this from Packers Wire. Quote, mobile 4-year starter with desired NFL intangibles and leadership, but a lack of passing talent. Clifford will have his moments, but he doesn't consistently deliver the ball with accuracy and timing. His arm strength falls below the mark. So I think a lot of things you hear for him when you read what the scouts say is really good intangibles, really smart, in meetings, which is good for a backup quarterback. That's a handy trait to have. I know it's not exactly something you'd necessarily want to hear like as the first thing you hear when you're like, oh, you took this guy in the 5th round. What's he good at? It's like, well, he's really good in meetings. It's kind of damning with
the line lack of passing talent. Ouch.
It's not great. I feel like it's a bit harsh, and we'll talk a little bit about how I feel about him personally.
And I had seen some things, kind of other quotes about him. About some of it is they was blamed on like bad footwork, and so that he's in terms of his accuracy, that if he's got bad platform, causing throws to sail, and so maybe some of that is fixable. Maybe
you might think so, but at the same time. At the same time, he's been at a high-level program for 4 years. I think expecting him to get better at things is, I think, might be a little bit wishful thinking. Like, he's had a lot of reps. Like, if he was going to get better, I think he probably would have.
Yeah, let's see.
But at the same time,
he's thrown 1,300 passes in his college career, so it's not for lack of trying.
Yeah. It's not for lack of trying, and he's been a 4-year starter at a major college program. It's not like he was at some like smaller school where it's like might not have the best coaching. It's like, no, you're at Penn State, you're in the Big Ten, you're playing against high level competition, you have the best coaches. Like you would probably, if you were going to improve, you probably would have.
He's had some good targets too. Jahan Dotson, who was drafted.
Hamler, I think, was there for a bit,
and the guy this year. Is it Parker Washington?
Parker Washington
got drafted, so he's had some guys to throw to as well.
Exactly. And, do we want to talk about personal thoughts first, or do we want to talk about what the Packers said about him?
Let's see what the Packers say about it first.
Okay, so here are some Green Bay quotes. I took these from Packers Wire as well. A really good resource if you're looking for just kind of like an aggregation of Packers news is really good. This one is from LaFleur. Quote, Sean is a guy who is really intelligent. He's played a lot of games. He's got some athleticism. He's a natural thrower. All the things we look for in quarterbacks, he possesses. We had him up here on a 30 visit and went through the meetings with him and were impressed by his football acumen and overall intelligence. And then Gutekunst said, quote, started a lot of games in the Big Ten, a lot of experience, really good athlete, liked his arm talent, brought him in for a pre-draft visit and really liked the makeup of the person. So it sounds like he really crushed that pre-draft visit. And then the second Gutekunst quote that I think I was talking about when I was talking about the run on quarterbacks is, quote, with Sean Clifford today, there was a quarterback run and a lot of quarterbacks underneath him went. So as we looked at it, we had a number of choices up there that were all kind of the same, but there weren't any quarterbacks after him that we felt strongly about like we did him. That made it easy. So in some ways, yes, I think part of it had to do with the fact that there was a massive run on quarterbacks right before they picked Clifford. But at the same time, it sounds like he did like really kill his pre-draft visit, is good in meetings like a lot of scouts and a lot of people around Penn State have said. And, those are qualities you do want in a backup quarterback. But Dad, do you want to talk a little bit about what your impressions were watching him?
Well, so I haven't gone in, I mentioned, but I didn't have time to do like a whole game of his like best and a whole game of his worst. But he does have the ability to run, get out of the pocket, and then try to make something happen. Sometimes he's on target, make some nice throws, fit into tight windows, but sometimes you see the ball just sails or is like way off from the guy he seems to be throwing to. So it's a mixed bag, as kind of you might expect. But also, in this much of a mixed bag where some of his bad throws are just really bad, that you might expect somebody with that to go a little later. But maybe some of the things are fixable if he can like improve his footwork at the release, and maybe Clemens can work some magic on him. But one thing I want to say about that quarterback run, there were like, and the value of the pick before we wrap up on our own thoughts is I think there were like 7 picks in 7 quarterbacks in a span of like a dozen picks. So it was a pretty dense run. Pick 127 to 149. Not one, two, three, four, five, six quarterbacks in like a
Yeah,
15
it was a
picks.
massive run on quarterbacks. Like it was a legitimate massive run on quarterbacks, and I think
Yeah.
some people said they would rather have had. I think Tanner McKee was the one that some people were higher on. Was it him that
Yeah,
went
but
later
there's
than
Tanner
Clifford? And that
McKee
was
from Stanford, went later. There's another guy. So so who went next? So he was the 11th QB taken, and most of the ranges here are somewhere around like 18 to 20. Um, in the QB rankings. Other players they could have had if they wanted to get another center to challenge, Oluwatimi from Michigan or Luke Whippler from Ohio State. If they wanted to kind of double up on safety or get a safety earlier, Daniel Scott from Cal went before. Really running back, Evan Hull, who they had in for a visit, or Moro Ajomo. So those are guys, I think, that they kind of passed them. So what I think happened in the end, and so now kind of if I want to transition to my own thoughts, what he was I think a very kind of cerebral player, and I think what they did is considering the pack. So now you look at it in hindsight, like the Packers' plans for backup QB seem to have been set a while ago to get their backup in the draft. They didn't want to pay for a backup QB, and so was Clifford the last one who was any good who was left? You know, the only ones who were taken afterwards were so Jaron Hall, Tanner McKee, and Max Dugan were the only other QBs taken in the draft after him. So only 14 total taken in the draft. Or no, maybe only two after, and maybe the other guys think he was an info. But maybe he could be like really effective as a backup. Maybe his better skills are to be a backup.
it's a ringing endorsement right there, Dad.
No, but maybe that's what they're drafting him for. Say we don't need it. We need somebody who can analyze the play, relate what he sees to the starter, and give him some advice rather than somebody who's going to run in there. I do like the fact that his athletic profile is in some ways similar to Love's, but with better agility, especially. He's got really, as you mentioned, great agility. And I've heard some other people give opinions about, well, maybe we don't want another QB that's so similar. Maybe we want somebody with a different style. I actually feel the opposite. I'm in favor of the backup being as similar to the starter in style as possible, so the offense doesn't need drastic changes if the backup needs to come in. A great example of this is how the Baltimore Ravens have set up their backup for a couple of years now, with Huntley behind Lamar Jackson.
Hey, that's Pro Bowl quarterback Tyler Huntley to you.
Right, and so he was set up to come in and run the exact same offense, and they didn't have to change everything around him. And I think that is a smart way to build your team.
Yeah,
personally.
And if we let's transition to my thoughts as well, unless you had anything to add, because I feel a lot of the same ways. I feel like he's kind of an ideal backup quarterback. I think having a backup quarterback with a lot of mobility, which Clifford has, is a good thing. I think, to me, when I watch him, I feel like I don't think he's as bad as people were saying. Like, I was expecting him to be a lot worse, honestly. Because people were like, oh, several people had not draftable grades on him. I think PFF was not draftable. Was not a draftable grade. I heard people on, I can't remember, was saying it was impossible to grade the Penn State wide receivers because Clifford was so bad. And I was like, okay, come on now, let's settle down a little bit. I mean, I don't think he's that bad, because when I was watching him, to me, he reminded me a lot of Taylor Heineke, where it's kind of gunslingery, not super accurate,
running wild untouched to the Packers defense. Taylor Heineke.
But the thing is, kind of gunslingery, not super accurate. The throwing motion isn't always the most consistent. But Taylor Heineke's been he's probably one of the best backup quarterbacks in the league. And Taylor Heineke is like able to make plays off schedule, able to run around, able to be on the move, will throw some like what are you thinking passes sometimes, but if you get Taylor Heineke in the 5th round, I think that's a fine pick, in my opinion. I think that's super valuable for a team. Like if you get like a mobile quarterback like in the 5th who can like maybe like go like 2-2 in like a 4-game stretch. Like that's what I think of as Heineke, at least. Like
I think that's
he's a good athlete
for a backup.
I think that's this.
I think
I don't think the bar is 2-2.
Well, this is with a hope for a backup. Is that when the backup has to come in, can you go 500 for the games the backup is in? I think that's, if you're doing that, I think you're doing well.
Yeah, I think so too. But that's the thing is, I think that like he's a good athlete. He's played a lot of football. He's very experienced. And the Packers really did need like another quarterback. Like I would have probably preferred if they had added a vet. That like there are some guys I think at the time I'm having trouble remembering who it was, but there was a couple I had in mind that would have been just like decent like vet options who are like career clipboard holders, but like are very good in meeting locker rooms. And maybe if Clifford's that, then that's very handy as well. But I do think that like Clifford could end up being like a Heineke type, and if you get a Heineke in the 5th round, that's like a very valuable pick in my opinion.
Yes, and it's somebody that you feel is good enough to come in and play a couple games for you.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, is there anything more you wanted to talk about with Clifford, or should we move on to Lew Nichols?
Well, that's the main thing. Is like you're like, okay, this maybe wasn't what I got to do, but they needed to get somebody somewhere to be a backup based on what seems to be their plan, and so this is the guy they wanted. There's a little danger.
They needed a backup.
Attached.
They needed a backup. He is a little on the older side too. He's 24. Is something to keep in mind. So
he's right. But he's older than Love. Right, he's like a couple months older than Love, so he's their veteran. He's their veteran backup.
That's true. They did get a vet backup in the end. But anyway, let's move on to Nichols. I think we've talked enough about Clifford. The next player we're going to talk about is the other one of their first of their 2 offensive 7th round picks. Sorry, I had to think about how I wanted to say that. Lew Nichols III, running back out of Central Michigan, pick 235. He's almost 22 years old. Very productive back out of college. What were your initial thoughts on him?
So my first thoughts was, okay, this is one of the running backs that they interviewed, or they had in for a visit, I should say. I was expecting / hoping for a 7th round or UDFA running back. I didn't think they needed to go any earlier than that because of having Dillon and Jones both back. I didn't think they needed to like grab somebody with a higher upside in like the 3rd or 4th round. And he was on my radar because of the Green Bay visit. I don't know if he otherwise would have been. Though I think I liked Evan Hull, one of their other visits, a little bit better because he has a little bit more athleticism, but he went earlier in the draft before they had a chance to earlier than I thought the Packers should pick a running back. How about you?
For me, I just think that, 7th round is where you take your shots on running back. So I have less initial thoughts on the player in specifics because I wasn't as familiar with him. But to me, just like taking a running back in the 7th round, that's good process to me. You take your shots there, see how they pan out. I think running backs are more a function of offensive line and scheme than anything. So I think the process was good, so I was happy with the pick, I guess is kind of how I landed on it. In terms of physical profile, though, we'll talk about that right now, I guess. He is not the best athlete. 7.91 relative athletic score. Unofficial because a lot of them are pro day numbers. Like we said, he's 5'10", 220, 22 reps on the bench. So good size, not the best height. Good reps on the bench. A 37-inch vertical is very good explosion, 86th percentile, but only a 9-foot, 7-inch broad, which is closer to like 40th percentile. It's not quite good at all. Bit of a slower back, 4.6, 140, which is just about average at the position. But an elite 10-yard split, at least, with 87th percentile, 1.55. And then poor agilities, or I guess a good shuttle at 4.2, but then a bad 3-cone at 7.43.
A really bad 3-cone there.
Yeah.
But both of his splits are great, actually. His 10 and 20. That's, I think, the thing to hang,
no breakaway
hang
speed.
his hat on. Right. So that's the thing.
Yeah,
And
just no breakaway speed at all. Is the thing.
He's not going 80 yards because somebody's going to catch him. But he's got some good starting burst, which, and some of that shows up on tape. And then we can look at his comps are mostly, not, they don't mean much to you as you look at it. It's RAS comps. Rudy Johnson from Auburn, Cedric Benson from Texas, Rashad Mendenhall from Illinois. That's somebody I heard of.
It's
Ron Jordan from Maryland.
I know Mendenhall and I know Benson. I mean, we know Benson from playing against the Bears for all those years, but it's more of like the thicker built, like heavier players. He's a thicker back.
He's dense, as I like to say. He's got a dense frame, and he's kind of that, or less flattering. You say he's got that bowling ball build, where he's short and big and not at all to be confused with a wide receiver.
Yeah, and, he has the slowest 40 time and the worst broad jump of Green Bay running backs drafted, and priority UDFAs. He's the first in, I guess, 6 years without a broad jump over 10 feet amongst running backs they've taken. But only Goodson and Aaron Jones have better 10 and 20-yard splits, and he's like 12 to 23 pounds more than each of them respectively. So, there are some things to like. I would say like the athletic profile is a bit worrying, but then when you look at the production, that's, I think, where he shines. And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the year to look at, it's been kind of a theme for this year, draft. His 2021 is much better than his 2022. His 2021 was, in some ways, amazing. He led the nation in yards from scrimmage, all-purpose yards, rushing yards, and yards per game in 2021. He had 1,846 rushing yards. His overall grade, PFF grade, was 84.8, elite in 2021. And then he came back substantially in 2022 at 62.5. His yards per carry, so they were coming down, had 6.4 in 2020 with only 78 attempts, not so many. Then he had 340 carries in 2021. At 5.4 yards per carry.
Yeah, and something to add for that though is in 2021 they had two linemen who ended up leaving the next year to go to the NFL. So pretty much two of their best offensive linemen left, and then also their starting tight end left as well, apparently, who was one of their better players. Yes. Didn't go to the league, but was one of their better college players.
So this may be why his 2022 was so much worse, where he went from going 5.4 yards per attempt to 3.5. He also has the ability. He's also a decent pass catcher. I mean, his backfield target shares were target shares of 6.4%, 11.8%, and 8% the last 3 years per player profiler. And his college dominator, so this is mostly as a receiver, is in the 68th percentile. And his target share was in the 81st percentile, also per player profiler. So he showed the ability to be a bell cow back running the ball and also catch passes out of the backfield. He rarely lined up.
Yeah, and when you have a player that has a lot of carries and a lot of work, I think there's kind of something that's like it cuts both ways, because like on one side, like a lot of tread on the tires. On the other side, it's like has proven he can take on a massive workload. So I feel like you can look at it both ways, and I just wanted to say that to play devil's advocate. So you can look at it both ways.
Oh man, he got overworked in 2021. Is that why he was down in 2022? I mean, showing the wear and tear, but he had most of his passing targets were out of the backfield, really low, as typical for running backs, average depth of target, half a yard. So a lot of screen passes as opposed to kind of moving all over the formation and getting out in the slot and things like that. But and a decent yak, 8.2 yards after catch per reception. And like some of our other receivers, higher drop percentage in his final year than previously. So it was like 7.1 and 9.1% in 2021 and 19.1% in 2022.
And it seems like, with a lot of these players, like you were saying, 2021 was better than 2022 for most of these players. I mean, we said it about Wicks. We said it about Reed. There was another one as well.
Reed big time.
Yep, said about Reed.
21 and 22. And Wicks just off the
But yeah,
charts better in 21
so
and 22.
yeah, that one's like that was the first one that popped to mind because it was so different. But Nichols, I mean, he was essentially he was one of the best running backs in the country in 2021, and I think you step back in 2022, not the best athlete, but like, hey, if you're banking on essentially in the 7th round, it's like you're not going to get athleticism, production, and like you're not going to get everything. Like you're kind of banking on one thing at that point, and they seem to be banking on that production. In terms of, did you have anything else you want to say about production, or should we talk a little bit about what scouts had to say about him?
I think I covered most of it, but yeah, but basically shows kind of well-rounded ability to do some of everything, including some pass pro. And I don't know if you've got anything on that.
And I mean, he's got the build for pass protection. I mean, 220, should be able to take on linebackers. In terms of what scouts had to say about him, though, Dane Brugler had him as his running back 26. Quote, with his blend of quickness and power, Nichols can be a tackle breaker and won't need gaping holes to reach the second level. But he can be methodical at times as he follows his blocks and needs to better anticipate openings before they present themselves. Overall, Nichols is a productive, determined runner with solid feet between the tackles, but his next level potential will be capped by a lack of creativity with the ball in his hands and inconsistent passing down skills. His workhorse approach could get him on the field in the right situation. And then Zierlein took this from Packers Wire. Quote, early down back with good size and power, Nichols runs with solid vision and the ability to create yards after contact, but he needs room to gain momentum and doesn't have the wiggle to create for himself if the blocking falters. He's smooth in his cuts, but he lacks the suddenness and play speed to stay a step ahead of NFL defenders. Nichols has an outside chance of making an NFL roster. So, sounds kind of like the scouting profile of a guy who would go in the 7th round, guy who would be a priority UDFA.
Yep. Outside chance of making an NFL roster. That seems to be the epitome of a 7th rounder. And other things I saw described about him is that he is pretty good at picking up blitzers. And as you mentioned, he's got the build for it, 220 and a low center of gravity. And also, I think willing to stick his nose in there, which I think is something maybe the Packers liked about him, as making him their running back of choice as a late round flyer.
Yeah. And it sounds like what Green Bay has said, it's going to be kind of an open competition between Taylor, him, and Goodson for that 3rd running back spot behind Jones and Dillon. I couldn't find too many quotes from the Packers about him, so I kind of just decided to supplement it with some quotes from his running back coach, Cornell Jackson at Central Michigan, who, by coincidence, was also Aaron Jones's running back coach at UTEP. So that's kind of a fun connection. They had the same running back coach. Apparently, he used to show Central Michigan highlights of Aaron Jones as kind of like teach tape. But just the quote from his running back coach, quote, he loves football. He never missed practice, never missed weights, never missed nothing. And that was from an Sports Illustrated article by Bill Huber about Nichols. So, a good player. I think personally my thoughts about him, a bit uninspiring in terms of like his burst and top speed. Seems like kind of a bit of a plotter, but the production in college is undeniable. And that alone is worth like a flyer in the 7th was kind of my general thoughts. I do worry a bit about like the lack of speed, lack of top speed, and like lack of like general explosiveness, kind of like limiting him in a special teams role. And those 3rd running backs do have to like contribute a lot on special teams to get on the roster. So I think that could be like a bit of a block in terms of him getting onto the roster, getting onto the 53. And that's like my main concern with him is just like how much can he contribute on special teams if he's not if he doesn't have a lot of speed. But only time will tell. Maybe he could be a good personal protector if he's a good pass blocker. You never know. But I know we're getting in the weeds a bit there. Dad, what did you think about Nichols?
So overall, I thought it was sort of super productive. I kind of liked some of his, decisiveness in hitting the hole when he gets the ball and like going just straight ahead. And he had, I think some bursts on that, initial line of scrimmage at the line, and maybe once in a while, like being able to put his foot in the ground to make a single cut, as opposed to like having a lot of like jukes and wiggle. And you could see, some of those like maybe 10 and 20 yard splits in some of those plays. But you can also see his 40 time as he's not going to go, as we mentioned earlier, like 80 yards to the house. He gets caught from behind. If he gets through to the second level, somebody eventually runs him down. But he also, one thing I would say in his favor, he really had in his second year, I don't know if I have the numbers on here, a high number of 10 plus yard runs in his junior year. So his best year. So that's something that's kind of it was like I forget how many it was, but it was a very high percentage. So in terms of the
Hmm.
consistency of moving of getting some chunk yards, even if you're not breaking off the big um, house the ball runs, he still was moving the chains with a lot of good runs. And maybe that's
Yeah,
is
and
something to hang a hat on. So we'll see what happens at the next level. I mean, I don't have super high expectations for him. I think got to be all-purpose back. Well, is he going to be better than Taylor or Goodson? I mean, those are the guys I think he's competing with.
that's
He's the 17th running back taken in the draft. Um, there's only one running back was taken after him, Kenny McIntosh, who was his testing was much worse than Nichols. He was only a 4.09 RAS. They had a few other possibilities, other positions. Jake Witt, we mentioned from Northern Michigan, Jomo. There's some other receivers they could have taken, or Corey Trice. They wanted to have another quarterback in addition to Valentine. There are a few ways they could have gone here, but mostly other players who didn't get drafted at all, but were UDFAs. They could have brought in another run stuffing defensive tackle, for example, which there were some options there instead of, and then getting a UDFA as a running back, and maybe Nichols still would have been available as an UDFA, but maybe they wanted to make sure they
yeah.
got somebody they had some ability that they liked.
You beat me to it by exactly, and you beat me to it by saying because it sounds like based on what I've seen from a couple other things around Twitter, there's a lot of people wanted him as an undrafted free agent. It sounds like just kind of based on polling of fans essentially, and so it's these seventh rounders are usually just people you would be your first picks as your UDFAs, and so getting first dibs on him there sounds like kind of a good move if it was someone that would be wanted by other fan bases. Not a bad decision. Anything else on Nichols you wanted to say? I mean, it seems like got the right attitude, maybe not the best athlete. I think it's going to be tough to beat out Taylor because they seem to really like Taylor. I'm
Taylor,
not sure.
in some ways he's a lot like Taylor, where he's sort of a jack of all trades, can catch some out of the backfield, can run the ball mostly up the middle as opposed to speed around the outside, and can do some pass pro. And how many running backs are they going to keep on the 53 this year? I mean, they only did 2 last year, and then basically rotated in from the practice squad for part of the year. And maybe they'll do that again. I don't know.
Yeah, at the time when they kept 2, we were like, oh, they're saving the spot for Kylan Hill, but then Kylan Hill got cut halfway through the year, so who knows?
Yep.
So anyway, that's kind of all we really had on Nichols. These 7th rounders, there's not quite as much to have. But let's move on to last one of the day. And the last pick the Packers had in the draft, Grant Dubose, wide receiver out of Charlotte, taken with pick 256. He's also almost 22 years old. He did start at Miles College, but they did cancel their season in the 2020 pandemic. He was kind of working odd jobs and then kind of got a chance to try out for Charlotte, and I guess it's just they were like, wait a minute, this guy is pretty dang good. Let's get him in here. But Dad, what were your initial reactions for him?
Yeah, the legend for that tryout is he ran 3 routes, and they're like, okay, you're good. You're on the team. We don't need to see you anymore. So it
kind of Wesley Snipes vibes in Major League, where he just ran on the field and
outsprinted everybody on this in socks or dress shoes or whatever the heck he was wearing.
Yeah. But what were your initial thoughts on Dubose?
So a 3rd wide receiver was something I expected. So I expected 2 early and a 7th rounder, just like last year. But I only had him on my radar in the last couple of weeks before the draft because people were starting to mention him as a possible Packer. And so he wasn't the only one I had on my radar as a 7th rounder. But I was glad they took another guy who seems to have some upside. Was my initial reaction when he was picked. I was like, okay, I could see that. Not surprised. It was the 3rd to last pick in the draft or something. It was really late.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of how I felt too. It was I was excited for him for where they got him. I was very excited. I had been seeing him go kind of 6th and 5th round. And that just tells you how much we're into the draft. We're excited to be getting a guy who was going in the 6th round in mock drafts in the 7th round. So I was excited about that, almost the last pick of the draft. I think it's a nice pick for a 7th rounder. Physically, he's a really good athlete. Move on to that now. 8.79 relative athletic score. He's 6'2", 201. 6'2" and a half almost, 201. 35-inch vertical and a 10-foot broad, so good composite explosion grade. Speed-wise, a 4.57, which, it's not amazing, but it's right around average. But an elite 10-yard split, a 1.52, which is in the 94th percentile, which amongst receivers, which is very good.
Really, really high 10-yard split. That seems to be
so really quick off the line.
A lot of the Packers players are actually, even when their 40 time isn't so great, you got a number of them with really good 10-yard or 10 and 20-yard splits. And we had this little discussion about this at one point where, okay, you see, is somebody really going to be able to make it in the league with such a bad 40? And it's like, well, maybe having a good 10 or 20 is good enough. And the reason you have a bad 40 is because as a low success rate is because that almost always correlates with a bad 10 and 20-yard split.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't had the time to go into the weeds about, can you see a difference between players that have good splits with a bad 40 as opposed to bad at all three and success rate? Just an interesting thing I'm throwing out there.
And then agilities were fine. I mean, his shuttle was poor. A 4.32 is like right around the 46th percentile. But the 3-cone was good. Ran the 79th percentile with a 6.89. His athletic comps for RAS aren't anyone you would ever heard of, but per playerprofiler.com, Dubose has a 41st percentile speed score, a 54th percentile burst score, 53rd percentile catch radius. They put him in the top 55th percentile in all-time in athleticism. And their player profiler comp is Jacoby Myers, who is now a receiver for the Raiders, was a receiver for the Patriots for a while, had a good amount of success in the league so far. His Senior Bowl speed measurements. You want to break these down for us, Dad?
Yeah. So this is what is it? The zebra tracker, whatever they put in the jersey
yep.
or the helmet somewhere to measure their on-field speed. And so they measure their top speed, their fastest acceleration in yards per second squared, fastest deceleration, and total number of explosive efforts. Is like, I forget how that's defined in like the top 10% of acceleration and deceleration plays, something like that. I forget exactly how the explosive efforts are defined. But so his top speed is not that great. Kind of what you see in his 40, it's middle of the pack, and he's actually below 50 percentile all time amongst receivers. So I've broken this data down by position. So among the 70 receivers, he's in the bottom in top speed measured on the field. However, in kind of keeping with his splits, he's above average in max acceleration and explosive efforts, and in the top 20%. So in the sort of what you'd be like, RAS is great in deceleration. So kind of his like stop-start ability seems to be a strength of his on the field based on the Senior Bowl speed measurements. And that's something that you can see, I think, in some of his plays as well.
I was just going to say, he was playing against lower levels of competition at Charlotte. So he is going to look like a better athlete than everyone out there on the field, kind of like something similar we talk with Carl Brooks. But, that's kind of what you want to see. I would say he did look pretty dominant. His production wasn't crazy at Charlotte by any means, but, receiver production in a lot of ways can sometimes be the function of the quarterback. It's not like he has, like, the best quarterback in the world throwing the ball to him. Did you want to talk a little bit about production? It sounded like you wanted to add something a little bit about athleticism.
I was going to say more about the Senior Bowl. I think he did. He carried himself pretty well in the one-on-ones in the Senior Bowls. I remember watching him, winning enough reps against high-level competition. And I feel like he actually even still did okay when Charlotte kind of played up in competition, able to get some plays. Again, he's another one who had a better 2021 than 2022 in terms of his kind of raw production, and the PFF grades are not that different. He did, so he got, what was his total? He had like 889 yards in 2021, 793 yards in 2022, 12 to 14.5 yards per reception. in the 2 years. His decent yards after the catch per reception, 4.8. I mean, not great, but his depth of target is pretty good at 11.7. He did most of his work, I would say, and had his best rating when he was targeted in the middle and the right of the field. So I think he's mostly lining up right and then crossing in the middle, and not nearly as much work on the left side, and mostly in the 0 to 10 yard segment and the 10 to 20 yard segment. This is all per PFF, and very little effective usage as a deep target over 20 yards. Only 2 of 13 total targets were completed to him at over 20 yards, and producing 1 TD and 3 interceptions when he was targeted that deep. For his career, he caught 125 passes on 210 targets for 1,688 yards. Per player profile, so some of the things that are kind of, he had a breakout age of 20.2, so 56th percentile there, and a college dominator in the 50th percentile. But yards per reception at the 21st, and the yards per reception not the 21st percentile. But so kind of the mid-level receiver by some of the metrics. His QB rating when he was targeted by NFL Draft Buzz was 94.9, and per PFF 95.1. So those are matching very well. His quarterback, Chris Reynolds.
Yeah, but it looks like here his quarterback rating when targeted was actually lower than his overall quarterback rating.
Right. So his quarterback actually had a good rating in 2021 and 2022. It's slightly better overall than Dubose's quarterback rating when targeted. So he's not actually lifting. He's close to what the quarterback was doing when targeting everybody. So it wasn't like he was kind of carrying the team. He led Charlotte in receptions, but not yards in 2022, and he led the team in receptions and yards in 2021. There was one player in 2022, Elijah Spencer, who had a higher QB rating when targeted than Dubose did, and he transferred to Minnesota after this year. And he was more of their downfield threat than Dubose.
Yeah. And for Dubose, scouts had pretty decent thoughts on him. For instance, Brugler had him as his wide receiver 27 and had him in the 5th to 6th round grade. So to get him in the 7th is nice. Quote from Brugler, quote, Dubose owns a good-sized frame and plays even bigger with his natural ball skills and mid-air adjustments, regardless of the coverage. But even with hesitation routes or double moves, he will struggle to create early or vertical spacing against NFL-level cornerbacks. Overall, Dubose plays with the body fluidity and catch-point talent that increases chances of finding a permanent home in the NFL, although he has work to do to be considered more than just a jump ball weapon or zone beater. He has rotational value as an NFL rookie, is kind of what he thought. So, some things to work on. Personally, I felt like watching him, just for a 7th rounder, he has, like Brugler said, really nice build and body control. I felt like I said, like Carl Brooks, it seemed like he was just more athletic and better and way more sudden than the players he was playing against. I felt like his hips seemed very fluid, and he got in and out of his breaks really well, and cut upfield really well with the ball in his hands. I felt like I do. So something to say is he has not really practiced yet with the Packers, which I think is a bit concerning. I think he missed all of rookie camp and then has not practiced in the 2 open portions of OTAs. So that's kind of something that's a little concerning and maybe a reason that he fell all the way to the 7th. But just something to keep an eye on. I think if he's healthy, a really exciting 7th round pick is kind of my personal thoughts.
Yeah, I think what I would say about him is, so we haven't actually seen him, unfortunately, at OTAs to see what it is. And at these time frames, there not have been that many time covered by whatever this injury is. So we have, of course, not heard anything about. I'd say he's kind of a strong frame wide receiver. And one thing I think fans are going to like, people are going to like having him on their team and will hate having him on the opposing team. If you love yourself some smack talk from your team, this is your guy. He loves to give, so he gets a lot of contested catches, especially in the end zone where they're basically going up with these moss players. So he loves to give the too small hand signal after making a contested catch over somebody.
The too small is such a classic celebration. It is iconic, and I love every time. If he did that after every catch, I wouldn't hate it.
Those cornerbacks hate it when he's giving them that signal after just mossing them in the end zone. And overall, I would say is the thought is there's some other possibilities. They could have gone so they could have gone different directions with this pick as a late if they wanted to get a developmental offensive lineman. There are a couple like um, Ojukwu from Boise State and what's his name, John Gurridge from Florida, who were offensive tackles. They went on Fuzz, and I thought they both had potential, but it seems like the Packers were more interested in going a different direction than developmental offensive linemen. I feel like they had enough of those. But I did like the athleticism of some other receivers who went undrafted. Matt Landers from Arkansas and Bryce Ford Wheaton from West Virginia, who was like the most athletic wide receiver in the draft. They're both taller than Dubose and significantly faster, like 4.3 something speed as opposed to 4.57. And Landers even had more yards. So you could have seen the Packers go in a different direction here with both of those players being available. And so something they liked about Dubose more than either of those. And they could have done also something completely different by going for like a run stuffing defensive tackle, which they did do. They got to kind of gap penetrating defensive tackles. So another direction they could have gone. There are some options for that as well. He was the 33rd wide receiver taken in the draft, the last wide receiver taken in the draft, only 4 picks before the end. So he wasn't quite Mr. Relevant. So hopefully he'll be Mr. Relevant for the Packers. So yeah, I think he does have some ability to make some plays.
Okay, that's enough. That's enough out of you. No more puns of that
you're
kind.
Done. You've had too much Coke today.
I'm bringing you back to the rails. We're done. We're wrapping it up. But anyway, thanks so much for coming and listening to us break down some more of the Packers rookies, as well as the Packers' second open OTAs. We appreciate you with sticking for us. We appreciate you for sticking with us this long. There we go. That's what I meant to say. We will be doing another episode next week. We will be covering the last 3 rookies we have left, which are Anders Carlson, Carrington Valentine, and Anthony Johnson Jr. Last of our deep dives, and then we will still be doing an episode a week until the season starts, when we will be doing 2 episodes a week. Like we said earlier, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker if you like what you heard. Come subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice, Spotify, Apple, Google, etc., etc. YouTube, we would very much appreciate. Would really help us grow our numbers. Good for the algorithms. Anyway, thanks so much again for listening. We hope you enjoyed this. Talked Clifford. We talked Lew Nichols, and we talked Dubose. And we can't wait to talk about more players. So until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.